The morning of August 21st, 1942, Alligator Creek, Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock stood behind his defensive line on the west bank, watching the darkness across the narrow sandbar. His Marines had been awake for hours, fingers on triggers, waiting. 10 minutes earlier, a dying man had staggered into their lines, bayoneted 7 times, throat slashed open, barely able to speak. Before collapsing, Sergeant Major Jacob Vouza had gasped out a warning. 500 Japanese soldiers were coming. Right now, Pollock's battalion held positions along a tidal lagoon the Marines mistakenly called Alligator Creek. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The sandbar connecting both banks was perhaps 30 yards wide at low tide. Beyond it, in the coconut grove and jungle darkness, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's elite troops were massing for attack. Ichiki believed he faced a handful of frightened Americans who would break and run. He was about to discover how catastrophically wrong intelligence could be. This is the story of how 900 Japanese soldiers walked into a killing ground they thought would be their easy victory, and how the Marines let them come close enough to ensure not one would leave alive. It's a story about fire discipline, tactical patience, and the moment when Japanese military confidence collided with American defensive doctrine. But most of all, it's about the terrible mathematics of warfare when cultural certainty meets calculated lethality. 7 days after midnight on August 7, 1942, United States Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal's beaches. The landing caught Japanese forces completely unprepared. Within 24 hours, Marines had seized the nearly complete airfield at Lunga Point, soon to be named Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, killed at Midway. The Japanese construction workers fled into the jungle, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and their half-finished runway. For Major General Alexander von der Greift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, the airfield represented everything. Control of Henderson Field meant control of the air over the Solomon Islands. Control of the air meant supply ships could reach Guadalcanal. Without the airfield, the Marines would be cut off, starved out, defeated. Everything depended on holding that strip of coral and dirt. The Japanese understood this calculation identically. Within hours of the American landing, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo activated emergency response plans. The 17th Army, based at Rabaul under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, received orders. Retake Guadalcanal immediately. Destroy the American garrison. Recapture the airfield. But Hyakutake faced a problem. Most of his forces were committed to the New Guinea campaign. He had few units available for immediate deployment to Guadalcanal. The unit he could spare was the 28th Infantry Regiment veteran troops from the 7th Division, originally assembled to assault Midway Island. That operation had been cancelled after the American naval victory in June. Now these elite soldiers would be redirected to the Solomon Islands. The 28th Regiment's commander was Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki. At 49 years old, Ichiki was a career infantry officer who had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1916. He had served 2 tours as an instructor at the Army's infantry school in Chiba. His combat experience was extensive. His reputation was formidable. Ichiki's name carried particular weight because of one incident 5 years earlier. On the night of July 7, 1937, Major Ichiki had been a battalion commander in the China Garrison Army near Beijing. During a practice night attack around the Marco Polo Bridge, one of his soldiers, Private Shimura Kikujiro, failed to return to his unit. Ichiki, believing the Chinese had captured the missing man, demanded immediate permission to search the nearby walled town of Wanping. When Chinese authorities refused, Ichiki ordered an attack. That attack became the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the opening battle of the Second Sino-Japanese War. 8 years of brutal conflict across China began because a soldier went to relieve himself in the dark and got lost, and because his company commander assumed the worst and acted aggressively. The missing soldier had actually returned to his unit before dawn, but by then, fighting had already begun. Whether Ichiki felt pride or regret about triggering a war remains unknown. What is certain is that his superiors considered him decisive, aggressive, and unafraid to take initiative. These qualities made him the logical choice to command the first Japanese response to the American landing on Guadalcanal. Ichiki's orders were straightforward. Take the first element of the 28th Regiment, approximately 900 men, to Guadalcanal. Assess the situation. If the American force appeared small and vulnerable, attack immediately and recapture Henderson Field. If the Americans proved stronger than expected, establish a defensive position and wait for the remainder of the regiment to arrive with heavy weapons and artillery support. On August 18, 1942, 6 Japanese destroyers loaded Ichiki and 916 soldiers at Truk in the Caroline Islands. The destroyers made the high-speed run to Guadalcanal overnight, arriving at Taivu Point 22 miles east of Henderson Field before dawn on August 19. The Japanese unloaded quickly, and the destroyers departed before American aircraft from Henderson could attack. Ichiki established his headquarters near the beach and sent scouts westward toward the American perimeter. What those scouts reported would determine whether Ichiki attacked immediately or waited for reinforcements. The decision would affect not just Ichiki's immediate fate, but Japanese strategy for the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The Marines defending Henderson Field numbered approximately 11,000 men, the 1st Marine Division, understrength from the rushed deployment, but still a substantial force. They had established a defensive perimeter roughly 6 miles long, running from the Lunga River on the west to the Tenaru River on the east, with the ocean forming the northern boundary and jungle hills to the south. These Marines were not the inexperienced troops Ichiki expected. Many were veterans of the Iceland occupation in 1941. They had trained extensively in amphibious warfare. Their officers understood modern defensive doctrine, interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery coordinates, defense in depth. Most importantly, they had 2 weeks to dig in, string barbed wire, and prepare their positions. The Marines also possessed intelligence advantages Ichiki knew nothing about. Since mid-1942, American cryptanalysts had been reading Japanese naval codes with increasing regularity. Station Hypo, the naval intelligence unit in Hawaii, had intercepted and decoded messages connecting Ichiki's unit with Destroyer Squadron 2. The Marines knew Japanese reinforcements were coming. They knew approximately when and where those reinforcements would land. More valuable still was the Coast Watcher network. British colonial officials and Australian military personnel had remained behind when Japanese force swept through the Solomon Islands. These Coast Watchers, operating from hidden camps in the jungle with powerful radios, tracked Japanese ship and aircraft movements. They radioed warnings to Henderson Field whenever Japanese forces approached. One Coast Watcher proved particularly valuable. Sergeant Major Jacob Vouza had retired from the British Solomon Islands Protectorate Armed Constabulary in 1941 after 25 years of service. When Japanese forces invaded Guadalcanal, the 50-year-old Vouza returned to duty, volunteering to work with Major Martin Clements, a former British district officer now serving as a coast watcher. Vouza's knowledge of Guadalcanal's terrain and his ability to move unseen through jungle, the Japanese found impenetrable, made him invaluable. After the American landing, Vouza made contact with the Marines and offered his services as a scout. The Marines, desperate for intelligence about Japanese positions and movements, accepted gratefully. Vouza began ranging far beyond the American perimeter, observing Japanese activities and reporting back. On August 19th, the same day, Ichiki landed at Taivu Point. Vouza was conducting a reconnaissance patrol east of the perimeter when he spotted Japanese troops. Vouza counted numbers, noted weapons and equipment, and began working his way back to American lines to report what he had seen. But the Japanese had also sent out patrols. A Japanese unit spotted Vouza and gave chase. Vouza ran, but the Japanese caught him. They searched him and found a small American flag, a souvenir gift from a Marine hidden in his loincloth. The flag proved Vouza was working for the Americans. The Japanese tied him to a tree and began interrogation. They wanted to know how many Americans defended Henderson Field. Where were their positions? How many artillery pieces? How many aircraft? Vouza refused to answer. The interrogation became torture. When Vouza still would not talk, the Japanese used bayonets. They stabbed him in both arms. They stabbed him in the shoulder. They stabbed him in the face. They stabbed him in the stomach. Finally, they slashed his throat not deeply enough to kill instantly, but enough to silence him. Then they left him tied to the tree to die. Vouza waited until he could no longer hear his captors. Then he began chewing through the ropes binding him. It took hours. When he finally freed himself, he was bleeding heavily from multiple wounds, barely able to move. Most men would have sought shelter, tried to stop the bleeding, waited for death or rescue. Vouza instead began the 3-mile journey back to American lines. He crawled when he could not walk. He walked when he could not run. He followed paths through the jungle, even as blood loss made him increasingly weak. He had information the Marines needed. He had seen Japanese troops gathering for an attack. He had to warn them. Meanwhile, Ichiki's scouts were returning to Taivu Point with their own reports. They had observed the American perimeter from a distance. They had noted the positions along Alligator Creek. They reported the perimeter appeared lightly defended. They had seen some Marines, but not massive troops. The airfield itself appeared vulnerable. What Ichiki's scouts could not see were the Marines dug into defensive positions back from the creek bank, concealed by jungle and deliberately positioned to avoid observation. They could not see the artillery batteries positioned to fire on pre-registered coordinates. They could not see the 11,000 Marines spread across the entire perimeter. They saw what they expected to see. A small American force, hastily positioned, vulnerable to aggressive attack. Ichiki evaluated the intelligence. He had explicit orders to wait for reinforcements if the American force appeared strong, but the intelligence suggested the opposite. The Americans appeared weak. They had abandoned most of their heavy equipment when the Navy withdrew after the Battle of Savo Island. They were running low on supplies. They were probably demoralized, knowing they had been left behind, cut off from support. Japanese military doctrine emphasized aggressive action and offensive spirit. Defensive positions could be overcome through superior willpower and fighting spirit. Americans, according to Japanese propaganda, lacked that martial spirit. They were soft, pampered, individualistic. When faced with determined assault, they would break and run. Ichiki had seen Chinese troops break under aggressive night attacks. He expected Americans would do the same. Ichiki made his decision. He would attack immediately. He would not wait for reinforcements. The first element, his 900 men, would be sufficient to retake Henderson Field. He would attack at night, using darkness to close with American positions. He would use the traditional tactics that had worked for Japanese forces throughout the China War and the Pacific War. A rapid approach, a shouted battle cry, a bayonet charge that would shatter enemy morale through sheer audacity and fighting spirit. On the afternoon of August 19th, American Marines ambushed a 38-man Japanese patrol east of the perimeter. The firefight was brief and brutal. Most of the Japanese died. The Marines searched the bodies and found documents revealing a larger Japanese force was nearby regimental strength, perhaps 1,000 men. Vandegrift received the intelligence and immediately ordered reinforcements to the eastern perimeter. If the Japanese attacked, they would most likely come from the east, from Taivu Point. The obvious approach would be along the coast, crossing Alligator Creek where it met the ocean. Colonel Clifton Cates, commanding the 1st Marine Regiment, deployed his forces along the western bank of Alligator Creek. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 1st Battalion held the southern sector. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion held the northern sector, directly covering the sandbar where the creek met the beach. To strengthen the sandbar defences, Cates added 100 men from the 1st Special Weapons Battalion, equipped with two 37mm anti-tank guns. These guns could fire canister-shot, essentially giant shotgun shells, filled with steel balls that would turn the sandbar into a killing zone. Marine artillery 75mm 105mm howitzers, pre-targeted coordinates on the eastern bank and sandbar. Forward artillery observers positioned themselves in the front-line positions, ready to call fire missions the moment Japanese troops appeared. The Marines worked through the afternoon and evening of August 20th, improving their positions. They dug deeper foxholes. They strung additional barbed wire. They positioned machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire. They distributed extra ammunition to every position. They checked and rechecked weapons. Then they waited. Ichiki's column was marching toward them through the jungle. Ichiki had left 125 men as a rear guard at Taivu Point. He was bringing the remaining 791 soldiers west in a night march. His plan was to approach American positions under cover of darkness, probe for weak points, then launch a decisive assault just before dawn. Ichiki moved confidently. He had sent scouts ahead and received no report of American activity. The path to Henderson Field appeared open. His troops were elite soldiers, trained and ready. They had their orders. They knew their objective. They moved silently through the dark jungle, weapons ready, confident in their training and their spirit. At approximately 11 o'clock on the night of August 20th, Vouza staggered into the marine perimeter. He had been travelling for hours, losing blood, barely conscious. The Marines who found him immediately saw his wounds and called for medical assistance. They tried to carry him to the aid station. Vouza refused to go. First, he had to make his report. He insisted on being taken to the command post. There, gasping through his slashed throat, losing consciousness, he told Martin Clemens and Lieutenant Colonel Pollock what he had seen. A large Japanese force, he estimated 250 to 500 men, was coming. They would attack soon. Very soon. Vouza had just given the Marines their 10-minute warning. The Japanese were already approaching Alligator Creek. Within minutes, Pollock's Marines would see movement in the darkness across the sandbar. Within hours, they would test whether American defensive doctrine could withstand Japanese offensive spirit, whether patience and discipline could defeat aggression and confidence. The battle was about to begin. At 2:30 in the morning of August 21st, 1942, Marine outposts on the west bank of Alligator Creek heard bursts of machine gun fire from the darkness ahead. The firing slackened after a few minutes. Most Marines assumed it was a patrol action, small Japanese units probing American positions, a nightly occurrence since the landing 2 weeks earlier. But Lieutenant Colonel Pollock knew better. Vouza's warning was fresh in his mind. A large Japanese force was approaching. This was not a patrol. This was the beginning of something much larger. Pollock moved among his positions, checking readiness, reminding his Marines of their orders. Hold fire until the command came. Let the Japanese get close. Let them commit to their attack. The overlapping fields of fire would work only if every Marine maintained discipline and waited for the signal. Across the sandbar, Ichiki's lead elements had reached the eastern bank of Alligator Creek. Japanese scouts moved forward cautiously, checking for American positions, looking for wire obstacles or defensive preparations. They found the sandbar undefended. No Marines visible, no immediate resistance. The beach and the creek mouth appeared open. Ichiki received this report and made his assessment. The Americans had established a thin defensive line somewhere beyond the sandbar, but they had not fortified the creek crossing itself. This was the weak point he needed. He would send his assault force directly across the sandbar, overwhelm whatever thin defensive line existed beyond it, and push straight through to Henderson Field. Japanese military doctrine for night attacks emphasized speed, shock, and psychological impact. Troops would approach in silence, then launch their assault with battle cries designed to terrify and disorient the enemy. The combination of darkness, sudden noise, and aggressive bayonet charges had broken Chinese defensive lines repeatedly during the China War. Ichiki expected the same result against Americans. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, the first wave of Japanese troops began moving across the sandbar. They advanced in a column formation, moving quickly but quietly, bayonets fixed, prepared to charge the moment they made contact with American positions. The Marines on the west bank saw them coming, dark shapes moving across the pale sand, silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky over the ocean. The range closed 100 yards, 75 yards, 50 yards. Still, the Marines held their fire. The Japanese kept coming. At approximately 30 yards, when the lead Japanese soldiers were almost at the barbed wire strung along the western bank, the order came. Every Marine on that section of the perimeter opened fire simultaneously. Machine guns, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, raked the sandbar from multiple angles. The 37mm guns fired canister shot point-blank into the packed column of Japanese troops. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Rifle fire from dozens of positions converged on the sandbar. Artillery shells, called in by forward observers, began exploding among the Japanese troops still crossing from the eastern bank. The effect was catastrophic. Japanese soldiers fell in heaps on the sandbar. Those who survived the initial volley tried to push forward, screaming battle cries, attempting to reach American positions. The Marines kept firing. The interlocking fields of fire meant that any Japanese soldier who survived fire from one position immediately came under fire from another angle. Some Japanese troops made it through the barbed wire. A few even reached Marine foxholes, engaging in hand-to-hand combat before being killed. But these were individuals, not the massed charge that Japanese doctrine required. The assault wave had been shattered before it could build momentum. Ichiki, watching from the eastern bank, saw his lead companies destroyed in minutes, but he did not retreat. Japanese military culture emphasized perseverance, aggressive spirit, overcoming obstacles through willpower. If the first attack failed, the proper response was to attack again, harder. Ichiki ordered a second assault. More troops moved onto the sandbar. The Marines had not stopped firing. The second wave suffered the same fate as the first, cut down by concentrated fire before they could close with American positions. The Japanese regrouped. They tried a different approach. Small groups attempted to wade through the surf at the creek mouth, flanking the sandbar defences coming up at the beach from the north. Marine positions along the beach met them with the same disciplined fire. Canister rounds from the 37mm guns swept the waterline. Japanese soldiers fell in the breaking waves. Throughout the night, the pattern repeated. The Japanese would gather on the eastern bank, work themselves into a fighting frenzy, then charge across the sandbar or through the surf. Each time, concentrated Marine fire stopped them. Bodies piled up on the sand. Wounded Japanese soldiers crawled back toward their lines, leaving trails of blood. But still, Ichiki ordered more attacks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Marines had advantages beyond good defensive positions. They had superior firepower, more machine guns per unit than Japanese formations typically faced. They had abundant ammunition, stockpiled in preparation for exactly this kind of defense. They had artillery support that Japanese troops attacking at night could not counter. And they had radio communication that allowed commanders to shift forces and coordinate fire in real time. But the Marines also had something less tangible. They had seen the intelligence reports about Japanese tactical doctrine. They understood that Japanese forces would attack aggressively, would attempt to create psychological shock through battle cries and bayonet charges. The Marines were prepared for exactly the kind of attack Ichiki was launching. They were not surprised. They were not intimidated. They simply executed their defensive plan. As dawn approached, the Japanese attacks continued but with decreasing intensity. Ichiki's force had suffered staggering casualties. Bodies covered the sandbar. Wounded men lay throughout the coconut grove on the eastern bank. The first element of the 28th Infantry Regiment, 900 elite soldiers who had landed at Taivu, 36 hours earlier, had been reduced to a few hundred effectives. Ichiki faced a decision. He could withdraw with his surviving troops, retreat back to Taivu Point, wait for reinforcements, and admit the attack had failed. Or he could continue attacking, commit his remaining forces, and accept whatever outcome resulted. Japanese military culture made the first option nearly impossible. Withdrawal meant admitting defeat. It meant failing in his mission. It meant bringing shame on himself, his regiment, and the army. For an officer of Ichiki's generation and training, such shame was unacceptable. Ichiki gathered his remaining officers and issued orders for another attack. At approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, as the sky began to lighten, the Japanese attempted one more assault. This time they tried to flank the Marine positions by advancing through the surf farther north along the beach. The results were identical to the previous attacks. Marine fire cut them down before they could establish any foothold. By 6 o'clock, with full daylight arriving, the Japanese attacks had stopped. Ichiki's force had been fought to exhaustion. They held positions in the coconut grove on the eastern bank, pinned down by Marine fire, unable to advance or retreat across the exposed sandbar. Now the Marines prepared their counterattack. Vandergrift had held Cresswell's 1st Battalion in reserve during the night. Now he ordered Cresswell to cross Alligator Creek upstream from the fighting, move through the jungle, and attack the Japanese from the south and east, cutting off their retreat to Taivu Point and trapping them against the creek. At dawn, Cresswell's Marines crossed the creek and began their flanking movement. Simultaneously, Marine artillery intensified its bombardment of the Japanese positions in the coconut grove. Aircraft from Henderson Field, the same airfield Ichiki had intended to recapture, took off and began strafing runs against Japanese troops attempting to escape along the beach. The flanking attack achieved complete surprise. Cresswell's Marines attacked from the rear while Pollock's Marines maintained pressure from the west. The Japanese found themselves caught in a shrinking pocket of land, taking fire from multiple directions, with the ocean at their backs and no avenue of escape. Some Japanese soldiers attempted to fight their way out. Most were killed quickly. Others attempted to hide in the coconut grove, hoping to survive until darkness allowed escape. The Marines brought forward 5 M3 Stuart light tanks. The tanks crossed the sandbar now passable with the tide out and entered the coconut grove. They fired their 37mm guns and machine guns at any Japanese soldiers who showed resistance. They also simply drove over Japanese soldiers who would not surrender, crushing them under the tank treads. The fighting continued through the morning. By noon, organized Japanese resistance had ended. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the Marines had secured the entire area. The Battle of Tenaru was over. The afternoon of August 21st, Marines walked through the coconut grove, counting bodies, checking for survivors, collecting intelligence materials. What they found shocked even combat veterans. Japanese dead lay everywhere on the sandbar, in the coconut grove, in the surf, scattered along the beach. The bodies were not spread out across a wide battlefield. They were concentrated in the small area where the killing had been most intense. Official counts documented 777 Japanese dead. Another 30 soldiers had escaped back to Taivu Point during the confusion of the final hours. 15 wounded Japanese had been captured, most unconscious from blood loss. Of the 916 soldiers who had landed with Ichiki 2 days earlier, only 128 survived. American casualties stood at 44-35 killed and 9 wounded. The casualty ratio was approximately 17-1. This was not the result of Japanese incompetence or American technological superiority alone. This was the mathematical result of disciplined defensive fire against massed frontal attacks. As Marines moved through the battlefield, they discovered something disturbing. Some Japanese soldiers who appeared dead were actually alive, waiting for Americans to come close before attempting one final attack. Several Marines were shot or stabbed by soldiers they thought were corpses. Others triggered grenades concealed beneath bodies of Japanese soldiers who had saved one last weapon for a final act. After several Marines were killed this way, the order went out. Any Japanese soldier on the ground who moved was to be shot immediately. No chances would be taken. The Marines, who had fought by the rules of modern warfare, now found themselves in a conflict where their enemy's cultural values created situations that fell outside those rules. 3 Marine officers approached what appeared to be a dead Japanese soldier. The soldier suddenly sat up and attempted to shoot them with a pistol. One of the officers, Lieutenant Colonel Cresswell, was nearly killed before the Japanese soldier was shot down. After this incident, Marines systematically checked every body, shooting or bayoneting any that showed the slightest movement. The Marines also found evidence of Ichiki's presence. Documents identified him as the unit commander. But Ichiki's body was never definitively identified. Japanese accounts differ on his fate. Some claim he died during the final assault. Others state he committed seppuku ritual suicide after witnessing the destruction of his regiment. The most detailed Japanese accounts suggest Ichiki burned his regimental colours, then shot himself rather than face the humiliation of reporting his defeat. For the Marines, the victory at Tenaru represented psychological proof of something they desperately needed to believe. They could defeat Japanese forces in ground combat. Since Pearl Harbor 9 months earlier, Americans had suffered defeat after defeat in the Pacific. Wake Island had fallen. Bataan had fallen. Singapore had fallen. The Philippines had fallen. The myth of Japanese invincibility had grown with each Allied defeat. Tenaru shattered that myth. Japanese soldiers, despite their reputation for fanaticism and martial spirit, could be killed in large numbers by properly prepared American forces. Japanese tactics, despite their history of success against Chinese armies, were inadequate against American firepower and defensive doctrine. Japanese confidence, despite its roots in genuine military accomplishment, could become a fatal liability when it led to underestimating American capabilities. The battle also validated American defensive doctrine. The interlocking fields of fire, the pre-registered artillery coordinates, the fire discipline that allowed Japanese forces to close to effective range before opening fire. All of these elements had worked exactly as planned. The Marines had not panicked when Japanese soldiers charged screaming at their positions. They had not broken when some Japanese soldiers penetrated their lines. They had maintained their positions and executed their plan. For Sergeant Major Jacob Vouza, the battle brought recognition and honours. He survived his wounds, receiving 16 pints of blood during emergency treatment. 12 days after being bayoneted 7 times and left for dead, Vouza was back on his feet, volunteering to scout for the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion. His warning had given the Marines the 10 minutes they needed to prepare for Ichiki's assault. Without that warning, the Japanese might have achieved tactical surprise. Major General van der Grift personally presented Vouza with the Silver Star for refusing to divulge information under torture. Vouza later received the Legion of Merit for his continued service with the Raiders. The Marines made him an honorary Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, the first native Solomon Islander to receive that honour. The British government awarded him the George Medal for gallantry. In 1979, Queen Elizabeth knighted him, making him Sir Jacob Vouza. Vouza continued serving his fellow islanders after the war, becoming district headman in 1949 and president of the Guadalcanal Council from 1952 to 1958. He maintained friendships with Marines for the rest of his life. In 1968, he visited the United States as honored guest of the 1st Marine Division Association. He wore his Marine Corps tunic until his death on March 15, 1984, and was buried in it. A monument in his honor stands in front of the police headquarters building in Honiara, the capital of the Solomon Islands. The Japanese response to Tenaru revealed how completely Ichiki's confidence had been shared by his superiors. When survivors reached Taivu Point and radioed Rabaul with news that the Ichiki detachment had been almost annihilated at a point short of the airfield, officers at 17th Army headquarters responded with disbelief. Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Matsumoto, the operations officer who knew Ichiki personally, declared the report must be false. It seemed impossible that a veteran officer leading elite troops had been killed along with most of his men by Americans the Japanese considered inferior soldiers. For 2 days, Japanese headquarters clung to optimism. Reports stated, "Gunfire still heard near the airfield. Aircraft with lights are flying all over the place." Tokyo received word that the Ichiki detachment is still in good shape near the airfield. They are apparently still storming it. Only when additional survivors reached Rabaul with detailed accounts did Japanese commanders accept the truth. The defeat forced Japanese strategic revision. They had assumed American forces on Guadalcanal numbered perhaps 2,000 men, a small garrison that could be overwhelmed by a single regiment attacking aggressively. Tenaru proved this assumption catastrophically wrong. The Americans had 11,000 Marines, well-equipped and well-positioned. Recapturing Henderson Field would require a much larger force with heavy weapons and air support. 3 weeks after Tenaru, the Japanese tried again at the Battle of Edson's Ridge, this time employing 6,000 troops in a coordinated assault. They came much closer to success, but still failed to recapture Henderson Field. Each Japanese attempt to retake Guadalcanal involved larger forces and more sophisticated planning. Each failure reinforced the lesson of Tenaru. American forces could not be defeated through aggression and fighting spirit alone. The battle also became part of American popular culture. The 1945 film Pride of the Marines depicted the battle, focusing on Corporal Al Schmid, a Marine machine gunner who was credited with killing 200 Japanese soldiers during the fighting. Schmid was blinded by a grenade during the battle, but continued fighting, directing his gun by sound. He received the Navy Cross. The film made him a national hero. In 2010, the Battle of Tenaru became the climax of Episode 1 of HBO's miniseries, The Pacific, produced by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks. While the dramatized version took liberties with specific details, it captured the essential truth. Marines on Guadalcanal faced an enemy who would rather die than surrender, and who believed American forces would break under aggressive assault. The battlefield itself remains largely unchanged. The Coconut Grove still stands on the eastern bank of what Marines called Alligator Creek, but which is actually the Ilu River, a tidal lagoon, not a creek, and home to crocodiles, not alligators. Sandbar, where 700 Japanese soldiers died, is still visible at low tide. Japanese tourists sometimes visit the site on pilgrimage to honor their countrymen who died there. The tactical lessons of Tenaru influenced American defensive planning for the rest of the Pacific War. The battle demonstrated that properly prepared defensive positions, with interlocking fields of fire and adequate artillery support, could defeat numerically significant Japanese forces. It validated the Marine Corps' emphasis on fire discipline and coordinated defensive fire. It proved that American forces, properly led and properly positioned, did not need to fear Japanese soldiers' reputation for fanaticism and martial spirit, but perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. After 9 months of defeats and retreats, American forces had won a clear, decisive victory in ground combat against elite Japanese troops. The Marines on Guadalcanal knew that Japanese soldiers could be killed, that Japanese tactics could be countered, that American defensive doctrine worked. This knowledge spread through the Pacific theater, changing the psychological balance between American and Japanese forces. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.